Chapter 36 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36. Private and confidential, relating to family matters, showing how Mr. Kenwigs underwent violent agitation, and how Mrs. Kenwigs was as well as could be expected. It might have been 7 o'clock in the evening, and it was growing dark in the narrow streets near Golden Square, when Mr. Kenwigs sent out for a pair of the cheapest white kid gloves, those at 14 pence, and selecting the strongest, which happened to be the right-hand one, walked downstairs with an air of pomp and much excitement, and proceeded to muffle the knob of the street door knocker therein. Having executed this task with great nicety, Mr. Kenwigs pulled the door to after him, and just stepped across the road to try the effect from the opposite side of the street. Satisfied that nothing could possibly look better in its way, Mr. Kenwigs then stepped back again, and calling through the keyhole to Morlena to open the door, vanished into the house, and was seen no longer. Now, considered as an abstract circumstance, there was no more obvious cause or reason why Mr. Kenwigs should take the trouble of muffling this particular knocker than there would have been for muffling the knocker of any nobleman or gentleman resident 10 miles off, because, for the greater convenience of the numerous lodgers, the street door always stood wide open, and the knocker was never used at all. The first floor, the second floor, and the third floor had each a bell of its own. As to the attics, no one ever called on them. If anyone wanted the parlours, they were close at hand, and all he had to do was walk straight into them, while the kitchen had a separate entrance down the area steps. As a question of mere necessity and usefulness, therefore, this muffling of the knocker was thoroughly incomprehensible. But knockers may be muffled for other purposes than those of mere utilitarianism, as, in the present instance, was clearly shown. There are certain polite forms and ceremonies which must be observed in civilized life, or mankind relapse into their original barbarism. No genteel lady was ever yet confined. Indeed, no genteel confinement can possibly take place without the accompanying symbol of a muffled knocker. Mrs. Kenwigs was a lady of some pretensions to gentility. Mrs. Kenwigs was confined, and therefore Mr. Kenwigs tied up the silent knocker on the premises in a white kid glove. "I'm not quite certain neither," said Mr. Kenwigs, arranging his shirt collar and walking slowly upstairs, "whether, as it's a boy, I won't have it in the papers." Pondering upon the advisability of this step, and the sensation it was likely to create in the neighbourhood, Mr. Kenwigs betook himself to the sitting-room, where various extremely diminutive articles of clothing were airing on a horse before the fire, and Mr. Lumley, the doctor, was dandling the baby, that is, the old baby, not the new one. "It's a fine boy, Mr. Kenwigs," said Mr. Lumley, the doctor. "You consider him a fine boy, do you, sir?" returned Mr. Kenwigs. "It's the finest boy I ever saw in all my life," said the doctor. "I never saw such a baby." It is a pleasant thing to reflect upon, and furnishes a complete answer to those who contend for the gradual degeneration of the human species, that every baby born into the world is a finer one than the last. "I never saw such a baby," said Mr. Lumley, the doctor. "Morlena was a fine baby," remarked Mr. Kenwigs, as if this were rather an attack by implication upon the family. "They were all fine babies," said Mr. Lumley, and Mr. Lumley went on nursing the baby with a thoughtful look. Whether he was considering under what head he could best charge the nursing in the bill was best known to himself. During this short conversation, Miss Morlena, as the eldest of the family, and natural representative of her mother during her indisposition, had been hustling and slapping the three younger Miss Kenwigses without intermission, which considerate and affectionate conduct brought tears into the eyes of Mr. Kenwigs, and caused him to declare that, in the understanding and behaviour, that child was a woman. "She will be a treasure to the man she marries, sir," said Mr. Kenwigs, half aside. "I think she'll marry above her station, Mr. Lumby." "I shouldn't wonder at all," replied the doctor. "You never see her dance, sir, did you?" asked Mr. Kenwigs. The doctor shook his head. "Aye," said Mr. Kenwigs, as though he pitied him from his heart. "Then you don't know what she's capable of." All this time there had been a great whisking in and out of the other room. The door had been opened and shut very softly about 20 times a minute, for it was necessary to keep Mrs. Kenwigs quiet, and the baby had been exhibited to a score or two of deputations from a select body of female friends who had assembled in the passage and about the street door to discuss the event in all its bearings. Indeed, the excitement extended itself over the whole street, and groups of ladies might be seen standing at the doors, some in the interesting condition in which Mrs. Kenwigs had last appeared in public, relating their experiences of similar occurrences. Some few acquired great credit from having prophesied the day before yesterday exactly when it would have come to pass. Others again related how that they had guessed what it was, directly they saw Mr. Kenwigs turn pale and run up the street as hard as ever he could go. Some said one thing and some another, but all talked together and all agreed upon 2 points. First, that it was very meritorious and highly praiseworthy in Mrs. Kenwigs to do as she had done, and secondly, that there was never such a skilful and scientific doctor as that Mr. Lumby. In the midst of this general hubbub, Dr. Lumby sat in the first floor front, as before related, nursing the deposed baby, and talking to Mr. Kenwigs. He was a stout, bluff-looking gentleman, with no shirt-collar to speak of, and a beard that had been growing since yesterday morning, for Dr. Lumby was popular, and the neighbourhood was prolific, and there had been no less than 3 other knockers muffled, one after the other, within the last 48 hours. "Well, Mr. Kenwigs," said Dr. Lumby, "this makes 6. You'll have a fine family in time, sir." "I think 6 is almost enough, sir," returned Mr. Kenwigs. "Pooh, pooh," said the doctor. "Nonsense, not half enough." With this the doctor laughed, but he didn't laugh half as much as a married friend of Mrs. Kenwigs's, who had just come in from the sick chamber to report progress, and taken a small sip of brandy and water, and who seemed to consider it one of the best jokes ever launched upon society. "They're not altogether dependent upon good fortune, neither," said Mr. Kenwigs, taking his second daughter on his knee. "They have expectations." "Oh, indeed," said Mr. Lumby, the doctor. "And very good ones too, I believe, haven't they?" asked the married lady. "Why, ma'am," said Mr. Kenwigs, "it's not exactly for me to say what they may be, or what they may not be. It's not for me to boast of any family with which I have the honour to be connected. At the same time, Mrs. Kenwigs's is, I should say," said Mr. Kenwigs abruptly, and raising his voice as he spoke, "that my children might come into a matter of £100 apiece, perhaps more, but certainly that." "And a very pretty little fortune," said the married lady. "There are some relations of Mrs. Kenwigs's," said Mr. Kenwigs, taking a pinch of snuff from the doctor's box, and then sneezing very hard, for he wasn't used to it, "that might leave their £100 apiece to 10 people, and yet not go begging when they had done it." "Ah, I know who you mean," observed the married lady, nodding her head. "I made mention of no names, and I wish to make mention of no names," said Mr. Kenwigs with a portentous look. "Many of my friends have met a relation of Mrs. Kenwigs's in this very room, as would do honour to any company, that's all." "I've met him," said the married lady, with a glance towards Dr. Lumby. "It's naturally very gratifying to my feelings as a father to see such a man as that a-kissing and taking notice of my children," pursued Mr. Kenwigs. "It's naturally very gratifying to my feelings as a man to know that man. it will be naturally very gratifying to my feelings as a husband to make that man acquainted with this event. Having delivered his